Welcome to the launch of the World Educational Research Association International Research Network, entitled Student Voice for Promoting Equity and Inclusion in Schools. The network was approved in July 2023 and will run for 3 years. And the purpose of these networks is to synthesize knowledge, examine the state of research, and stimulate collaborations or identify promising directions in research areas of worldwide significance. And we focus on learning from one another through exchange of ideas and the research that we carry out in different parts of the world. The founding members of our network come from 5 universities in 4 countries, UK, USA, Portugal, and Spain. However, our founding members' research spans across more countries such as Austria, Denmark, Cyprus, Nigeria, and the Philippines. I am Kiki Meshu from the University of Southampton here in England, and I'm the co-convener of the network, alongside Professor Elizabeth Koslewski from Stanford University. Elizabeth, if you want to wave, I can see you're there. And we also have Dr. Jay DeLoreis and Dr. Vivian Rank from University of Southampton, my colleagues here, and wave at people if you have already arrived. And from Spain, we have Autónoma University of Madrid with Dr. Cecilia Simón, and University of Vic as well from Spain with Dr. Nuria Simó and Dr. Laura Faré. And from Portugal, we have the University of Lisbon and Dr. Luis Tinoga. And we are the founding members, as I said, but we will be looking at expanding the group's membership in the future. Some logistics before we start. Please keep your cameras and microphones off whilst we listen to our keynote. And you can type any questions or thoughts in the chat that will be monitored, or you can ask your questions at the end of your presentation. We will have around 35 minutes presentation, followed by a discussion. And we are recording only the presentation, our keynote presentation. Special thanks to my colleagues, Chinmaya Podnis and Agnes Graudina, for helping with the organization of this event. And I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Alison Cook-Sather, for our launch. Alison is a leading figure in student voice and pedagogical partnerships, and we are honored that she has accepted our invitation for giving this keynote today. A bit of biography about Alison. Dr. Alison Cook-Sather is the Mary Catherine Woodworth Professor of Education at Bryn Mawr College and Director of the Teaching and Learning Institute at Bryn Mawr and Haverford Colleges. She has developed internationally recognized programs that position students and teachers as pedagogical partners, published over 100 articles and book chapters and 9 books, spoken or consulted on pedagogical partnership work in 13 countries, and played key roles in founding 3 journals: Teaching and Learning Together in Higher Education, International Journal for Students as Partners, and International Journal of Student Voice. Alison has served as a visiting scholar at a number of institutions, including University of Cambridge in England, and is the recipient of several awards, including the Alumni Excellence in Education Award from the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. And the title of Alison's presentation is Student Voice, Legacies, Challenges, and Possibilities. So over to you, Alison, and many thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Kiki and Elizabeth, for inviting me. I really appreciate this invitation. As I said, when I received it, I was so excited to see that there's so much work going on, of which I wasn't at the moment aware, and now I am, in the realm of student voice. This is really a place where I've worked a great deal in the past, and really for the last 30 years, and have seen pockets of this work emerge. But now I think with projects like yours, there's the possibility of really connecting people across context and building an even stronger movement. It's been a movement for a long time, but now I think it has the potential to be an even stronger movement. And just to give you a sense of how long I've been doing this photograph that I took here is from a project I started 30 years ago at Bryn Mawr and Haverford colleges that pairs undergraduate students preparing to be secondary teachers with high school students, with secondary students. And I'll say more about that. But this photo is taken from that project way back when I started this work and connected up with some of the few people that I'll share as my sense of contributing legacies to this work. And you can see from the title that that's what I'm going to talk about: student voice, legacies, challenges, and possibilities. But before I share my thoughts on all of those, I wanted to give you a moment or two just to jot down to yourself your own thoughts on what are the legacies, challenges, and possibilities of student voice work. I mean, you're all here because you care about this work, because you do this work, because you want to do this work. And I want to bring your voices into this conversation, especially during the Q&A, and regarding your own thoughts on the legacies, challenges, and possibilities. So I'm just going to be silent for a moment and ask you to jot down thoughts for yourself. What do you see? What are the legacies, challenges, and possibilities from your perspective regarding student voice work? Just take a minute for that. So just to give you a sense of what I'll be doing in about the next half hour is to share some definitions of student voice that I've worked with, that colleagues I've worked with over the years have generated. Some of my thoughts on the legacies, visions of pioneers in student voice work that I worked with across countries. I'll identify some of what I see as the challenges of student voice work, and then offer some thoughts on what schools can do to foster student voice and what universities and colleges can do to foster student voice. Share a few more examples of student voice work in practice, and then we'll move into the questions and discussion. And I've included in these slides images of texts that are, to my mind, some of the most important that have been published on this work. But of course, there are many more. And again, I let me say, am not aware of all the work that's going on. And I hope that those of you who are familiar with that work will add those to the chat and help contribute to connecting the body of knowledge and practice that's out there in terms of student voice work. So let's move to the next slide. So student voice, as I have defined it, and as many colleagues I've worked with have defined it, signals having a legitimate perspective and opinion, being present and taking part, and or having an active role in what Roger Holdsworth said as in decisions about and implementation of educational policies and practice. So they are present and active in those. And Roger Holdsworth is an important figure in this work, published in Australia, a magazine called Connect for many, many decades, really focused on student active engagement. So if you're not familiar with that publication, I highly recommend it. Important figure. And this image is one that I've seen used in many places, but I've had trouble tracing the origin of it. So again, so if anybody knows what the origin is, I would appreciate it. But the sentiment, nothing about us without us, is a statement that's been used for many, many, many years, really hundreds of years, about equity and inclusion, that there should be no policy and practice without the voices and contributions of those about whom the policies and practices are being made. So that's really a key notion, right, of student voice, is that students, as the ones who are often really the, well, recipients, victims, depending on which word you want to use, of policies made by people who are not students, really should be part of the conversation. So one of the key questions that has been asked over the years is one that Madeleine Arnaud asked in the Acoustics of the School: whose voice gets listened to? Right, and that's a useful question to ask about what's going on in schools, whose voices are strong and powerful. The stentorian tones, as Michael Fielding said, of some people who are not students speaking about what should be happening in schools. So student voice as a term asks us to connect the sound of students speaking not only with those students experiencing meaningful, acknowledged presence, but also with their having power right, to influence analyses of, decisions about, and practices in schools. And this is from an article that I wrote back in 2006 after spending some time in England with some of these colleagues, thinking together about what do we mean by student voice and how can we expand practices of student voice. One point about this term is that recently people have, can we go back? Yeah, have articulated the notion that voice may be an ableist term to be using to talk about what we mean here. I've always used voice more as a metaphor for power and presence, but it is worth thinking about the ableist assumptions behind speaking and having a voice as in the more literal sense. But again, I've thought about it in terms that Carolyn Heilbrunn, a feminist writer, used as really the right and the ability to take one's place in whatever discourse is essential to action and the right to have one's part matter. And so we maybe can think together about voice. I think we'll probably keep it because it's got a long legacy, but it's worth thinking about who it includes and who it excludes. So thank you. We can go to the next slide now. So legacies, I've mentioned a few already, Roger Holdsworth in Australia. And just to say a few more words about other colleagues, Michael Fullan, for instance, in Canada, back in 1991, asked another point, a very good question, just like the question of in the acoustic of the school, whose voice is heard, what would happen if we treated the student as someone whose opinion mattered, right? So radical. At the time, of course, those of us who embrace student voice think that is the key question, and how do we go about doing that? But at that time, it was not a question that was being asked. So in the early 1990s, Michael Fullan was one of the first, and Jean Courtney was very active in Speak Up. You see this at the bottom of the slide, a forum for student voice in Ontario. In the 2000s, and that carries through to today. That is a governmental structure in which the student voice is really valued and students are supported and listened to in a variety of ways. So there's a longish history in Canada of this work. Returning again to England, where I had some of my first connections with people doing student voice work, Jean Ruddock and Michael Fielding, and many other people at University of Cambridge, Julia Flutter, Helen Demetriou, and others. Michael and Jean wrote back then, we look at the links between student consultation and participation and the legacy of the progressive democratic tradition in our schools. And we look also at the difference between teaching about democracy as an investment for the future and enacting democratic principles in the daily life of the school, a commitment to the present. So what I think is important here is the highlighting of enacting the practices we claim to embrace, right? What does it mean to talk about these things as opposed to do them from minute one when students are learning about engaging in democracies? And Jean and Michael and others are very important leaders in that work. And then finally, looking to another part of the world, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Mary Berryman has done very important work with her colleagues there on Maori student voice, right? And she's written, Maori have missed out because their histories are not being told authentically, but so too have non-Maori because they haven't learned about Maori histories alongside European colonial history. They've learned a particular version of those events. And this, I think, really written a while ago, but is still absolutely perhaps even more relevant now as work that is pushing back against this kind of equity and inclusion, certainly in the United States, is doing its best to stop this kind of equity and inclusion work. And really all of the student voice work, the voices you see here, the text you see over on the one side of the slide are really about respect, inclusion, and democratic participation. Those to me are inextricably linked with concepts of voice. So those are just some of the legacies that I return to again and again in this work. Again, you may have other people and practices and contexts that you think of, and I hope we'll come to those in the question and discussion time. So we can move now to the next slide and to talk a little bit about the challenges of student voice. So I've identified several here that I have heard about, experienced, seen over the many years that I've done this work. So I'll just talk through each of these. And again, I encourage you either to build on these or to add others that you consider the challenges to be. So the first is really a very basic one, right? A form of ageism or adultism, right? And just to quote Bell, adultism's underlying behaviors and attitudes are based on the assumptions that adults are superior to youth and entitled to act upon young people without their agreement, right? That's the basic premise of ageism and adultism. And that's one of the things that makes one of the premises and assumptions and ideas that inform structures and practices that make student voice work very difficult. And it can be obvious and explicit, or it can be more implicit and insidious, that attitude. A second is assumptions based on students' capacities, which is related, of course, to ageism and adultism, that young people don't have the capacity to understand, to analyze, to recommend, to contribute to, because of their lack of experience. That's one reason many people point to students' incapacity to contribute, but also because of dimensions of their identities, because of racism, ableism, as well as ageism. So these assumptions about students' capacities typically are articulated by people who haven't tried having conversations with students and being in dialogue and collaboration with students, because those who do generally find tremendous capacity among students. And not only that, but insight that as soon as you cease being a young person and a student, you lose. And so being in that kind of dialogue, which is really the premise of partnership work, is to always be returning to those perspectives or gaining for the first time those perspectives, particularly from dimensions of identity you don't share, that should be informing educational practice. So a third is structures of school and schooling. Right, we have so many of them. I just listed a few here, but curriculum standards and standardized testing, certainly in the United States and many other contexts, really give teachers very little flexibility about what they teach and sometimes how they teach, and whose voice, gets to be heard in those processes. Roles, the assumption that there are distinct and separate responsibilities of teachers and students is another reality that is structured into most schools and schooling practices. And related directly to that is power dynamics, right? Who has power and what kind and why? And students typically have very, very little power. And that's by design, as well as by structure. And then finally, I think an important challenge to note is tokenistic approaches, right, which might seem to be enacting student voice work, but as Michael Fielding has pointed out, they can be benign but condescending, or cynical and manipulative. They can be what he's often called tick box exercises, right, where you just claim to be doing student voice work, but really that's not what it is. It's tokenistic and doesn't, in fact, engage with the kind of respect and partnership that what I would consider genuine student voice work does. So those are some of the challenges that I've identified. This text here I share in case you're interested in reading a number of stories. This was a collection that Dennis Thiessen, who was in Canada, and I published in 2007. And it was the first handbook of its kind that I am aware of to bring together accounts of student engagement in schools, and many of students' own voices are included in that text in Afghanistan, Australia, Canada, England, Ghana, Ireland, Pakistan, and the United States. So many chapters in there, many examples of student engagement and student voice work. So we can go to the next slide. So if these are the challenges, what can we do, right? And we were talking a little bit before we started here about how this work typically unfolds in pockets or under the guidance of individuals who have a vision and passion and commitment and energy to do this work. But there are things that schools can do to pursue student voice work and to support it. So one is that administrators can create spaces for dialogue. And I just give a couple of examples here. One is what one secondary school principal, Peter Evans, called a Solon Circle that was created for every single week. Students and others in the school would come together and talk about the issues that the school was facing, that the students were facing. It was really a space for dialogue. That if you don't create that space, again, the structures of school are probably going to prevent or at least make it very difficult to be in that kind of conversation. Another way that administrators or school leaders can do this work is to create what Dame Alison Peacock in the UK called listening schools, schools that are very explicitly committed to listening to student voice. And if there isn't an administrative commitment to that, if there isn't some sort of articulated value, it's difficult, for individual faculty and students and teachers and anybody else on the staff to create that kind of space. So that's one thing to think about. Who are the administrators? How might they leverage their institutional role to create these kinds of spaces? A second thing that schools can do is to use toolboxes and toolkits for consultation and dialogue. And there are a number of these, including, created by members of this group, right, that offer advice, guidance, everything from smaller, more manageable steps to larger, more systemic changes. And so there's a chapter in this Learning from the Student's Perspective, the book that I published back in 2009, that has a kind of a toolkit and steps and very specific strategies that people can use. So in this book, just to give you a sense, the Learning from the Student's Perspective, there are chapters written by secondary teachers in various schools in the US. There's the school principal, Peter Evans, that I mentioned. There's prospective secondary teachers. These are students who are in my teacher certification program, secondary teacher certification program, who wrote chapters as well. So there's another kind of student voice, people who are still students preparing to be teachers, articulating their understandings. And then there are also university-based researchers such as Helen Dimitriou and Bernadette Younes in the UK who contributed chapters there as well. So I think one of the things that's really important to see here is that all of these are about a diversity of voices, right? When you talk about student voice, yes, students are typically the ones who need to be brought in and typically aren't, but really it's about everybody's voice. It's not about silencing teacher or administrator voices. It's about bringing the student voices into dialogue with those in whatever form that might take. So that's really the last point here. All members of the school communities can share accounts of successful practices. And when you get those multiple perspectives, that's when you really have a much more informed sense of practice. So can we go to the next slide, please? Another thing that schools can do is to foster student voice is to invite students to be co-researchers for reform. Right, there are a number of resources here, books and other publications that talk about that should be happening and how that should be happening. So one of the key points that I and others have made down here at the bottom of the slide, student voice work shifts the frame from research on to research with students. And that is really key. Right, that's one of the main ideas of moving students from being passive recipients and subjects subjected to what adults do to subjects in the sense of actors and co-creators, right? And so here you have quite a number of books that document research projects, that offer discussion of research methods, and provide examples of what it can look like to do research with rather than on students. And I want to emphasize that part of what these texts do that's so important is to talk about research methods that are sensitive to context, culture, and age, right? And that shift, again, from on to with, but that means very, very different things in different contexts, right? And so it's important to consider and learn with and from those that are doing this work, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. In different cultures. One of the key lessons I learned, for instance, in going to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to talk about student voice and partnership is that a word like partnership is actually not one that you want to use in that context because of the colonial legacy. And that actually kind of goes against what people doing this work want to do. The term goes against it, even though the practices are very consistent with student voice work and partnership. So very important to learn that kind of what language, makes sense in which contexts. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the last two slides focused on what schools can do. And here I want to talk a little bit about what universities and colleges can do to foster student voice in schools. There's a whole other conversation about student voice in higher education, but the idea here is how can institutions of higher education support student voice in schools? And here's this same picture that was on the first slide, back with this project that I mentioned that I created in 1995 with a secondary teacher collaborator who taught in a local secondary school called Teaching and Learning Together. So what happened was I took on this new role in 1994 as director of the Bryn Mawr Haverford Education Department. We were very small back then, had a certification program, and I thought it makes no sense that we're certifying people to teach at the secondary level without providing opportunities for our certification candidates to be in dialogue with the people they're preparing to teach, to hear from them what makes an inclusive classroom, what makes a fair test, those kinds of things that if you only have those conversations in isolation on college and university campuses, there's going to be a disconnect. Right. And not only that, but you aren't going to develop a mindset of listening to and being in dialogue with students. So the idea with this program is that each undergraduate student at Bryn Mawr or Haverford College is paired with a student at a secondary school close by. And they exchange weekly messages. It started out with handwritten letters. People way back, I would drive the letters from the college to the schools. Of course, now they use all kinds of technologies, many of which I don't even understand, where they, exchange their ideas and are in a regular dialogue for the entire semester prior to the students, the college students doing their student teaching. So they really prepare to listen to and talk to students that they're going to be teaching subsequently. All of the secondary student participants meet weekly at the school, supported by a school-based educator, and are paid for their time. So this is the project that we developed way back in 1995. It's been going ever since. And the kind of insights that students get is like the one at the bottom of the slide here. Listening to the student's perspective can be more than just listening to the student's perspective on school. I want to listen to my students' lives. And this kind of understanding of the complexity, of what students live and what they are trying to manage as they're learning is a really important part of this work. So that's one example. Some institutions have tried to take this up, but it's challenging because of what I mentioned before about the structures of school and schooling. So we can move to the next slide. And I want to share a little bit about some other examples in this great book, Radical Collegiality Through Student Voice. That radical collegiality, as many of you may know, is a term Michael Fielding coined way back and that Rosanna and Judith took as the title of their book. And they explain that, of course, in the introduction. And in this text, there are sample projects across contexts, including school-based research projects with Maori youth in Aotearoa, New Zealand, collaborations with marginalized students in secondary schools in the Republic of Ireland, and the Minister's Student Advisory Council, student forums, and the Speak Up project that I mentioned before, sponsored by the Ministry of Education in Ontario, Canada. So you can read again about some examples of experience, policy, and practice, as the title suggests, of student voice across these contexts. And I also just want to mention the sample frames of analysis. This has been implicit and at some moments explicit throughout what I've been saying, that really when people write about student voice, they almost always bring in frames of power dynamics, right? What are the power dynamics at play and how does this work try to work against those? Citizenship participation work in school context is another one. How do we frame this work so that it is consistent with the claims and commitments that schools articulate about what they're supposed to be doing. And then finally, another frame, and this was certainly the case in Mary Berryman's work, about the underlying racism in schools and how do we work against that in efforts to support and further student voice work. So I want to go to this last slide here and just give you a minute to think about it as we move into questions and discussion. Return to what you wrote at the very beginning of my remarks and think about what questions you now have about the legacies, challenges, and possibilities of student voice work that I've shared, the ones that you wrote down at that very beginning. And think also about what research exists and what is needed to promote student voice for equity and inclusion in schools, really the work of this group, right? So to take a little minute, step back from these remarks, think about the work you've been doing, and jot down some ideas. I want to just end with a quote from a handbook chapter that Laura Lundy and I wrote a number of years back. The core principles of both children's rights and student voice call for a kind of respect and shared responsibility, a partnership in essence, that the traditional hierarchies and power imbalances structured into educational institutions do not easily allow or support. In order to be able to fully enact the principles articulated within the UNCRC and student voice within formal educational contexts, prevailing approaches to curriculum and pedagogy would need to position students as respected partners, agents with rights of voice and power, alongside teachers and others in the educational realm. So that kind of comes full circle to what I started with, and I'll give you a moment of quiet to think about these two questions, and then we can pop out of screen sharing mode so I can see all of you and we can talk about these things.